The last rays of sunlight slipped beneath the horizon, as Rebecca Stewart clutched her small valise with trembling fingers, watching the train that had brought her to San Andreas, California, disappear into the distance, taking with it the man who had promised her the world but delivered nothing but heartache and abandonment. It was October 1878, and the chill of the evening air seemed to seep through Rebecca's thin cotton dress, though perhaps it was the cold reality of her situation that truly made her shiver. At 22, she found herself alone, 5 months pregnant, and stranded at a train depot in a town where she knew not a single soul. The station was nearly deserted now, save for the station master who was preparing to close up for the night, and a tall figure standing in the shadows beneath the platform's overhang. Rebecca blinked back tears, her hand unconsciously moving to rest protectively over her swollen belly. James Whitfield had been so charming, so convincing with his tales of making a fortune in the gold fields of California. He'd promised to marry her once they arrived, said her parents would forgive their hasty departure from Chicago once they sent home news of their prosperity and marriage. Instead, he'd taken the money she'd brought her entire inheritance from her grandmother and disappeared the moment the train had stopped for water at the previous station. "Miss, station's closing up for the night," called the station master, an elderly man with kind eyes but a firm tone. "You got someone coming for you." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond but found her voice caught in her throat. What could she say? That she'd foolishly run away with a man who had abandoned her once she'd served his purpose. That she was carrying a child and had nowhere to go. "She's with me," came a deep voice from behind her. Rebecca turned sharply to find the shadowed figure stepping into the yellow lamplight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes marked him immediately as a cowboy worn denim, dusty boots, and a hat that he removed as he approached, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, met hers with a directness that made her heart skip. "That right, miss?" the station master asked, looking between them suspiciously. The cowboy's eyes never left hers, something in them asking her to trust him, though she had no reason to trust any man after what James had done. Rebecca began, then swallowed hard. "Yes," she said with more conviction than she felt. "Thank you for your concern." The station master nodded, seemingly satisfied, and retreated to finish his closing duties. Once he was out of earshot, Rebecca turned to her unexpected savior. "Why did you do that?" The cowboy settled his hat back on his head, adjusting it slightly against the evening breeze. "Name's Matthew Jensen. I saw what happened earlier. Saw that yellow-bellied coward sneak off the train back at Coalinga while you were sleeping." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Had her shame been so obvious to this stranger? "Don't reckon a lady in your condition ought to be left alone at night in a strange town," Matthew continued, his voice matter-of-fact but gentle. "There's a decent boarding house run by a widow woman just down the street. I can walk you there if you'd like." Rebecca hesitated. Back in Chicago, her mother had raised her to be wary of strangers, especially men with weather-beaten faces and calloused hands who lived their lives on the frontier. But her mother had also never found herself pregnant and abandoned hundreds of miles from home. I have very little money," she admitted, ashamed but seeing no point in pretending otherwise. Matthew nodded, seeming to consider this. "Mrs. Wilson, the boarding house owner, she's always looking for help. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. I expect she might give you room and board in exchange for work, at least until you." His eyes flicked briefly to her midsection. "Until I what, Mr. Jensen?" Rebecca asked, lifting her chin slightly. "Until I have my baby. Until I die of shame. Please don't mince words on my account. I've had quite enough deception for one lifetime." To her surprise, a small smile lifted the corner of Matthew's mouth. "Until you figure out what you want to do next, Miss Stewart. Rebecca Stewart. Miss Stewart," he repeated, and something about the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her feel less alone than she had moments before. "If you'll allow me, I'd be happy to make an introduction to Mrs. Wilson. She's a good Christian woman, stern but fair." Rebecca looked around at the darkening depot, the empty platform, and the unfamiliar town beyond. What choice did she have? "Thank you, Mr. Jensen. I would appreciate that very much." Matthew picked up her valise, and Rebecca noticed he was careful not to touch her as he gestured toward the street. "It's just a short walk. You feeling up to it?" The genuine concern in his voice almost undid her. Rebecca had not experienced real kindness in so long that she hardly knew how to receive it. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and they began walking away from the depot together. The streets of San Andreas were quiet as they walked side by side through the dusk. Rebecca stole glances at her companion, wondering why this stranger would bother himself with her troubles. "You're not from around here," she observed, breaking the silence. Matthew shook his head. "Not originally. Came out from Missouri after the war. Been working ranches ever since. And now got my own small spread about 5 miles outside of town. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." There was unmistakable pride in his voice. "Was in town picking up supplies when I saw you at the depot." Rebecca felt she should offer something in return for his openness. "I'm from Chicago, I was." She trailed off, unsure how to explain her situation without sounding like the fool she was. "You don't owe me your story, Miss Stewart," Matthew said, seeming to sense her discomfort. They walked the rest of the way in silence, until they reached a 2-story clapboard house with a small sign announcing Wilson's boarding house, hanging from the porch. Before Matthew could knock, the door swung open to reveal a stout woman with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age and experience, but her eyes were alert and assessing as they swept over Rebecca. "Matthew Jensen, what business brings you to my door at this hour? And with a young lady, no less." "Evening, Mrs. Wilson. This here is Miss Rebecca Stewart. She's new in town and in need of lodging. I thought of your place straight away." Mrs. Wilson's sharp eyes took in Rebecca's condition immediately, and Rebecca felt herself wither under the woman's scrutiny. To her surprise, however, the older woman's expression softened slightly. "Come inside, both of you. No sense standing on the porch for all to see." The interior of the boarding house was clean and modestly furnished, with a sitting room to the right and a dining room to the left. Mrs. Wilson led them into a small private parlor and gestured for them to sit. "Now, what's this all about?" Matthew looked to Rebecca, clearly leaving it to her to explain as much or as little as she chose. Rebecca drew a deep breath and decided that honesty was her only option. "I was traveling with a man who made me promises he had no intention of keeping. He abandoned me at the train depot today. I have very little money, but I'm willing to work. Mr. Jensen mentioned you might need help with cooking or cleaning." Mrs. Wilson's expression remained unreadable. "And the child?" Rebecca's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "Due in about 4 months, I believe." "You believe? You haven't seen a doctor?" "No, madam." Mrs. Wilson sighed deeply. "I run a respectable establishment, Miss Stewart." "Yes, madam," Rebecca said, preparing herself for rejection. "But I also know what it is to face hardship, Mrs. Wilson continued, surprising her. "My late husband left me with 3 young children and this house. If not for the kindness of others, I don't know what would have become of us." Hope fluttered in Rebecca's chest. "Does that mean?" "It means I have a small room on the 3rd floor. It's hot in summer and cold in winter, but it's clean. You can have it in exchange for help around the house, at least until your condition prevents you from working. After that, we'll need to make other arrangements." Relief washed over Rebecca like a wave. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. I promise I won't be a burden." "See that you aren't," the older woman replied, but there was no malice in her tone. "Matthew, perhaps you could bring Miss Stewart's bag upstairs. First door on the left at the top of the stairs." Matthew nodded and stood, taking Rebecca's valise once more. "I'll show you to the kitchen when you come back down," Mrs. Wilson said to Rebecca. "You can start by helping me prepare breakfast for the boarders tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock sharp." "Yes, madam," Rebecca replied, grateful for the opportunity despite the early hour. As Matthew led her up the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief at having found shelter, fear of what the future might hold, and an unexpected flutter of something else whenever she glanced at the broad back of the cowboy walking ahead of her. "Here we are," Matthew said, opening the door to a small but tidy room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. He set her valise down carefully by the bed. "It's not much, but Mrs. Wilson keeps a clean house." "It's more than I dared hope for," Rebecca said honestly. "Mr. Jensen, I don't know how to thank you." Matthew shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to gratitude. "No need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Rebecca said softly. "They wouldn't have." Their eyes met for a long moment, and Rebecca felt something pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness or understanding. "Well," Matthew said, breaking the moment, "I should be getting back to my ranch. Got animals waiting to be fed." "Of course." Rebecca followed him to the door. Will I see you again?" The question surprised them both, judging by the slight widening of Matthew's eyes. "I'm in town most Saturdays," he said after a moment, "for supplies and such." Rebecca nodded, not understanding why she should care one way or another when this stranger came to town, yet caring nonetheless. "Good night, Miss Stewart," Matthew said, placing his hat back on his head. "Rest well." "Good night, Mr. Jensen, and thank you again." As the door closed behind him, Rebecca looked around the small room that would be her home for the foreseeable future. It wasn't what she had imagined when she'd left Chicago, but it was a roof over her head and a chance to catch her breath. She placed a hand on her growing belly and whispered, "We'll be all right. Somehow, we'll be all right." The next morning came too quickly, with Mrs. Wilson knocking on her door at 4:30. Rebecca dressed hastily in the dim light of dawn and made her way down to the kitchen, where she found the older woman already at work preparing dough for biscuits. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson." "Morning. Hope you slept well because there's plenty to be done. 6 boarders need breakfast by 6:30, and then there's the cleaning and laundry after. Can you make a decent cup of coffee?" "Yes, madam," Rebecca replied, rolling up her sleeves. "And I'm handy with biscuits and gravy too, if that helps." Mrs. Wilson gave a curt nod. "That'll do. Coffee's in that canister there. Pot's on the stove." And so began Rebecca's new life in San Andreas. The days quickly fell into a routine of early mornings, hard work, and nights spent alone in her small room, wondering what would become of her and her child. The boarders' 4 men who worked in the mines and 2 elderly, widowed sisters were polite enough, but largely kept to themselves. Rebecca found Mrs. Wilson to be fair, if not particularly warm. The older woman worked Rebecca hard, but never beyond what she could handle, and always made sure she ate well. As the weeks passed, Rebecca's body grew heavier with child, and Mrs. Wilson quietly adjusted her duties to accommodate her condition. True to his word, Matthew Jensen appeared in town on Saturdays, and to Rebecca's surprise, he made a point of stopping by the boarding house each time. At first, his visits were brief, a polite inquiry after her health, perhaps a small gift of fresh eggs or a jar of honey from his ranch. But as autumn deepened toward winter, his stays grew longer. On one such Saturday in early December, Rebecca was sweeping the front porch when Matthew rode up on his chestnut mare. The sight of him still caused that strange flutter in her chest, though she tried her best to ignore it. "Afternoon, Miss Stewart," he called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Should you be sweeping in your condition?" Rebecca smiled despite herself. "I'm with child, Mr. Jensen, not made of glass. Besides, the fresh air does me good." Matthew tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the porch. She noticed he carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Brought you something," he said, suddenly looking almost shy. "Thought it might come in handy soon." He handed her the package. Rebecca carefully unwrapped it to reveal a tiny knitted blanket in soft yellow wool. "Oh," she breathed, running her fingers over the delicate stitches. "Did you?" Matthew's cheeks reddened slightly under his tan. "No, not me. Mrs. Tompkins at the general store. She has a way with knitting. But I picked the color. Figured it would work for a boy or a girl." Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "It's beautiful, thank you." "It's nothing," Matthew said, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "Just thought the little one might need it with winter coming on." Rebecca wiped away a stray tear, embarrassed by her display. "Mrs. Wilson says the baby could come as early as late January, though February is more likely. You feeling all right otherwise?" Matthew asked, his blue eyes serious as they studied her face. "I am. Tired, but that's to be expected." Rebecca paused, then decided to voice the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Mr. Jensen, may I ask you something?" "Course." "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't know me." "You certainly don't owe me anything." Matthew was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains. "My sister," he finally said. "She found herself in a situation not unlike yours back in Missouri. Man promised to marry her, then disappeared when he found out she was expecting. She was alone, scared." His voice grew rough. "No one helped her. She died trying to birth that baby, alone in a room she'd rented with the last of her money." Rebecca's heart clenched at the pain evident in his voice. "I'm so sorry." Matthew shook his head as if to clear away the memory. "Happened a long time ago. But when I saw you at that depot, something in your eyes reminded me of her. Couldn't just walk away." "Well, I'm grateful you didn't," Rebecca said softly. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Matthew cleared his throat. "I should let you get back to your work. Don't want Mrs. Wilson thinking I'm distracting her best employee." Rebecca smiled. "Will you come by next Saturday?" "Try and stop me," Matthew replied with a small grin that transformed his serious face. "Take care of yourself, Miss Stewart. And that little one." As she watched him ride away, Rebecca felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter sunshine. It was dangerous, she knew, to allow herself to feel anything for a man after what she'd been through with James. And yet, Matthew Jensen was nothing like James Whitfield. Where James had been smooth and charming, Matthew was straightforward and honest. Where James had made grand promises, Matthew offered small kindnesses that meant far more. But Rebecca reminded herself firmly that Matthew's kindness stemmed from the memory of his sister, not from any special regard for her. He was a good man helping someone in need, nothing more. And even if he did feel something more, what future could there be for a respectable rancher and a fallen woman with another man's child? The weeks passed, and Christmas came to San Andreas. The town dressed itself in modest holiday cheer, with pine boughs decorating the storefronts and candles glowing in windows. At the boarding house, Mrs. Wilson surprised everyone by baking a special Christmas pudding, and allowing Rebecca to decorate the parlor with holly and evergreen sprigs. On Christmas Eve, Rebecca was helping serve dinner to the boarders when there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Wilson went to answer it and returned with Matthew, snow dusting his shoulders and hat. "Look who's braved the weather to join us," Mrs. Wilson announced, and Rebecca was startled by the almost maternal tone in the usually stern woman's voice. Matthew removed his hat and nodded to the room. "Evening, folks. Mrs. Wilson was kind enough to invite me for Christmas Eve dinner." Rebecca caught Mrs. Wilson's eye and received a small, knowing smile in return. Had the older woman deliberately invited Matthew without telling her? "Come sit by me, young man," called one of the elderly sisters, Mrs. Abernathy. "I want to hear all about that new stallion you bought from the Carson Ranch." Matthew obliged, but his eyes sought out Rebecca's across the room, and the warmth in his gaze made her cheeks flush. She busied herself with serving the meal, grateful for the distraction. The evening passed pleasantly, with good food and conversation flowing freely. Even the usually taciturn miners contributed stories of Christmases past. When dinner was over, Rebecca began to clear the dishes, only to find Matthew at her elbow. "Let me help," he offered, taking a stack of plates from her hands. "You shouldn't be carrying so much." "I'm perfectly capable," Rebecca began, then sighed at his stubborn expression. "Thank you." They worked side by side in the kitchen, washing and drying in comfortable silence. When the last dish was put away, Matthew reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," he said, using her first name for the first time. Rebecca hesitated before carefully unwrapping the gift. Inside was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. "Oh, Matthew, it's beautiful, but I couldn't possibly—" "It was my mother's," he interrupted. "Nothing fancy, but I thought you might like to put a picture of your little one in it someday." Rebecca stared at the locket, deeply moved by the sentiment behind it. "I don't have anything for you," she said softly. "Wasn't expecting anything," Matthew replied. "May I?" He took the locket and motioned for her to turn around. Rebecca turned, lifting her hair as Matthew fastened the chain around her neck. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for such large hands, and the brief touch against her skin sent a shiver through her. "Thank you," she whispered as she turned back to face him. "I'll treasure it." Something shifted in Matthew's expression, a deepening of the warmth in his eyes that made Rebecca's heart race. He leaned slightly closer, and for a wild moment she thought he might kiss her. "Matthew." "There you are," Mrs. Wilson's voice broke the moment as she bustled into the kitchen. "Mr. Abernathy is asking about that horse of yours again. Says he might want to buy one for his nephew come spring." Matthew straightened, the moment lost. "Yes, madam. I'll go talk to him right away." As he left the kitchen, he gave Rebecca one last look over his shoulder, a look that held a promise of conversations yet to be had. The new year arrived, bringing with it harsher winter weather and increasing discomfort for Rebecca as her time grew nearer. Mrs. Wilson had gradually reduced her duties, until she was responsible only for light mending and occasionally helping with meal preparation, when she felt able. It was during a particularly fierce January blizzard that Rebecca first felt the pains begin. She had been sitting in the parlor, mending one of the miners' shirts when a sharp pain gripped her abdomen. She gasped, dropping the shirt to the floor. "What is it, child?" Mrs. Wilson asked, looking up from her account books. I think it might be time," Rebecca said, her voice shaking slightly. Mrs. Wilson was on her feet immediately. "How far apart are the pains?" "I don't know. That was the first strong one, but I've been feeling odd all day." The older woman nodded decisively. "Better get you upstairs and send for Dr. Parker. This storm's getting worse by the minute." Once Rebecca was settled in her room, Mrs. Wilson dispatched one of the miners to fetch the doctor. The pains increased steadily over the next hour, growing closer together and more intense. "Doctor will be here soon," Mrs. Wilson reassured her, wiping Rebecca's forehead with a cool cloth. "First babies often take their time, so don't you worry." But as the hours passed and the storm raged outside, there was no sign of the doctor or the miner who had gone to fetch him. Rebecca's labor intensified and fear began to set in. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" she gasped between contractions. "The doctor should be here by now." Mrs. Wilson's face was grim. "Roads might be impassable in this weather, but don't you worry, I've helped deliver more babies than I can count. We'll manage just fine." By midnight, Rebecca was exhausted, the pains coming one after another with barely a break between. She thought of Matthew's sister, dying alone in childbirth, and terror seized her. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Mrs. Wilson said firmly. "You're stronger than you know, Rebecca Stewart. Now bear down when I tell you." Just as Rebecca felt she could endure no more, there was a commotion downstairs, voices, heavy footsteps on the stairs, and then the door burst open. It wasn't the doctor who appeared, but Matthew, covered in snow, his face haggard with worry. Behind him stood a gray-haired woman Rebecca had never seen before. "Matthew," Rebecca gasped, disbelieving. "The doctor's trapped on the other side of the valley," Matthew explained breathlessly. "But I brought Mrs. Larson. She's been midwifing in these parts for 30 years. Mrs. Wilson looked relieved. "Thank the Lord. She's having a hard time of it." Mrs. Larson immediately took charge, checking Rebecca with practiced hands. "Baby's turned a bit wrong, but we can fix that." "You've done well to get this far, young lady." The next hour was a blur of pain, encouraging voices, and desperate effort. Matthew refused to leave, staying by Rebecca's side, letting her crush his hand with each contraction, murmuring words of encouragement and strength when she thought she could go on no longer. And finally, with one last tremendous effort, Rebecca's child entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the small room. "A boy," Mrs. Larson announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the infant. "A fine, healthy boy." Mrs. Wilson efficiently helped clean Rebecca while Mrs. Larson tended to the baby. When everything was settled, Mrs. Larson placed the swaddled infant in Rebecca's arms. "Hello, little one," Rebecca whispered, gazing down at the tiny red face. Overwhelming love washed over her, unlike anything she had ever experienced. "Hello, my son." She looked up to find Matthew watching them, his expression a mixture of awe and something deeper, more profound. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you knew to come, but thank you." "Had a feeling," Matthew said simply. "Couldn't stay away with that storm brewing and your time so near." Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Larson exchanged knowing glances. "We'll give you a few minutes," Mrs. Wilson said, ushering the midwife from the room. When they were alone, Matthew sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "He's perfect," he said, looking at the baby. "What will you name him?" Rebecca hadn't thought much about names, finding it too painful to plan when her future was so uncertain. But now, looking at her son and the man who had quite possibly saved both their lives, she knew. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Matthew." Matthew's eyes widened. "Rebecca, you don't have to, I want to," she interrupted. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what would have become of us. You've been our guardian angel, Matthew Jensen." Matthew reached out tentatively to touch the baby's tiny hand. "He's got a good grip," he said as the infant's fingers closed around his thumb. "He's going to be strong like his mama." Rebecca felt tears gather in her eyes. "I'm not strong. I've been so afraid." "Being afraid doesn't mean you're not strong," Matthew said quietly. "It's facing your fears that makes you strong." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Rebecca, there's something I need to say." Rebecca's heart began to race. Yes. I know it hasn't been very long, and maybe this isn't the right time with you just having the baby and all, but Matthew took a deep breath. I care for you, more than I should, maybe, given the circumstances. But I do, and I can't help thinking that maybe someday if you could feel something for me too. I already do, Rebecca whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. I have for some time now. The hope that bloomed in Matthew's eyes was like sunrise after the darkest night. I'm not a wealthy man, he said. My ranch is small and the work is hard, but I swear to you I would do everything in my power to make you and Thomas happy. I don't need wealth, Rebecca replied. I just need someone true, someone kind. She looked down at her son, then back at Matthew. Someone like you. Matthew gently touched her cheek. I'd like to court you properly, Rebecca Stewart, and if, after some time, you still feel the same way, I'd be the proudest man in California to call you my wife and this little fellow my son. Rebecca leaned into his touch, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment from abandonment and despair to the promise of a future filled with love. I would like that very much, Matthew Jensen. The storm outside continued to rage, but within the small room at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house, a new family had begun to take shape, born not of blood but of choice, compassion, and love. Spring came early to San Andreas that year, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the hills surrounding the town, and a sense of renewal that matched Rebecca's own blossoming hope. Thomas grew stronger every day, a happy baby with his mother's dark curls and a smile that could melt even Mrs. Wilson's stern demeanor. Matthew had been true to his word, courting Rebecca with a respectful patience that only deepened her growing feelings for him. He visited the boarding house several times a week now, often bringing small gifts for Thomas and treating Rebecca with a gentle deference that made her feel valued in a way James never had. On a particularly beautiful April afternoon, Matthew arrived at the boarding house with his wagon instead of his horse. I thought you and Thomas might like to see my ranch today, he suggested, a hint of nervousness in his voice. If Mrs. Wilson can spare you, that is. Mrs. Wilson, who had grown surprisingly fond of both Rebecca and Thomas, shooed them away with a knowing smile. Go on. It'll do you good to get some fresh air. Just be back before dark. The ride out to Matthew's ranch was pleasant, with Thomas sleeping contentedly in Rebecca's arms for most of the journey. As they crested a small hill, Matthew slowed the wagon. There it is, he said, a note of pride in his voice. It's not much, but it's home. Rebecca looked out over the neat homestead nestled in a valley of green grass. A modest but well-maintained house stood beside a large barn, with corrals holding several horses. A small creek ran along one edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees just beginning to leaf out. It's beautiful, she said sincerely, and was rewarded with one of Matthew's rare, full smiles. He guided the wagon down to the house and helped Rebecca down carefully, mindful of the baby in her arms. Would you like to see inside? The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and two small bedrooms off to one side. Everything was meticulously clean, if sparse. I built most of the furniture myself, Matthew explained, running a hand over the smooth surface of the pine table. Never was much for fancy things. It's lovely, Rebecca assured him, and she meant it. After the chaos and uncertainty of the past year, the simple solidity of Matthew's home appealed to her deeply. Thomas began to fuss, and Rebecca bounced him gently. I think he's getting hungry. You can use my bedroom if you need privacy, Matthew offered, leading her to a small room with a neatly made bed and a chest of drawers. I'll just be outside with the horses. When Rebecca had fed Thomas and returned to the main room, she found Matthew waiting nervously, a small wooden box in his hands. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing his tension. "Yes, just—" Matthew cleared his throat. "Rebecca, I know we agreed to court properly, and maybe this is too soon, but every day I spend with you and Thomas makes me more certain of what I want." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band. "This was my grandmother's ring. I'd be honored if you'd accept it and my name along with it." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "Matthew, I love you, Rebecca," he said simply. "I love Thomas too, as if he were my own flesh and blood. I want to be a husband to you and a father to him if you'll have me." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as she looked at this good, honorable man who had come into her life when she was at her lowest and had shown her nothing but kindness and respect ever since. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew." The joy that transformed his face was like nothing Rebecca had ever seen. Matthew gently took Thomas from her arms, placing him in a small nest of blankets on the sofa, then pulled Rebecca close. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of the life they would build together, and Rebecca knew in that moment that the train depot where she had once felt so abandoned had actually been the beginning of her journey home. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in San Andreas with Mrs. Wilson standing proudly beside Rebecca and Thomas dressed in a new outfit sewn by the Abernathy sisters. The entire boarding house turned out for the occasion, along with Matthew's neighbors and friends from town. After the simple ceremony, Matthew drove his new family home to the ranch that was now Rebecca's home as well. As the wagon pulled up to the house, Rebecca noticed something different. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a new addition at the side of the house. Matthew smiled. "A surprise." "Come see." He helped her down and led her around to find a covered porch with a handmade rocking chair sitting on it, painted white and cushioned with soft pillows. "Every mother needs a place to rock her baby," he explained. "I thought you might like to sit out here in the evenings." Rebecca was moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "It's perfect," she said, sitting in the chair with Thomas in her arms and giving it a gentle rock. "Absolutely perfect." The summer passed in a blur of happiness, as Rebecca learned the rhythms of ranch life and Matthew adapted to being a husband and father. Thomas thrived in the fresh air, growing plump and increasingly active. By autumn, he was beginning to pull himself up on furniture, determined to explore his world. Rebecca found unexpected joy in the simple routines of their life together, making breakfast while Matthew did the morning chores, working side by side in the vegetable garden, sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set over the hills. Matthew proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to ride a horse properly, how to milk the cow, even how to shoot a rifle just in case. The physical side of their marriage had been a revelation to Rebecca. What had been endured with James became a source of joy and connection with Matthew, who treated her body with reverence and ensured her pleasure before his own. In his arms, Rebecca discovered a passionate side of herself she had never known existed. On a crisp November day, just over a year after they had first met at the train depot, Rebecca waited anxiously for Matthew to return from town. She had news to share, news that had been confirmed by Mrs. Larson just the day before. When Matthew rode up to the house, Rebecca was waiting on the porch with Thomas, who squealed with delight at the sight of his father and toddled unsteadily toward him. "There's my big boy," Matthew exclaimed, scooping up the child and tossing him gently in the air, delighting in his laughter. He gave Rebecca a kiss, then looked at her curiously. "Everything all right? You look like you're about to burst with something." Rebecca took a deep breath. "I saw Mrs. Larson yesterday." Matthew's expression immediately turned concerned. "Are you sick?" Is it Thomas?" "No, nothing like that," Rebecca assured him. "Matthew, we're going to have a baby. In late spring, Mrs. Larson thinks." For a moment, Matthew stood perfectly still, Thomas balanced on his hip. Then a slow, wondering smile spread across his face. "A baby, our baby." Rebecca nodded, tears of happiness threatening to spill. "Our baby." Matthew whooped with joy, startling Thomas into giggles. He pulled Rebecca into a one-armed embrace, holding his family close. "I love you," he whispered fiercely. "Both of you. All three of you," he corrected himself with a grin. As winter settled over San Andreas, Rebecca often thought about how much her life had changed in just over a year. From the desperate young woman abandoned at the train depot to a beloved wife and mother with another child on the way, it seemed almost too much happiness to believe. One snowy afternoon, as she sat sewing baby clothes while Thomas napped, Matthew came in from the barn with a thoughtful expression. "Penny for your thoughts," Rebecca said, setting aside her sewing. Matthew sat beside her on the sofa. "I was just thinking about fate, I guess. How if I hadn't been in town that particular day? If I hadn't seen that no good fellow sneak off the train leaving you behind, we might never have met." Rebecca reached for his hand. "I've thought about that too. It's strange to think that the worst moment of my life led me to the best ones." "Do you ever wonder about him?" Matthew asked carefully. "About James?" Rebecca considered the question. "Not really. Not anymore. Whatever led him to do what he did, it was his loss. I have everything I could ever want right here." She placed Matthew's hand on her growing belly. "Right here with you." Matthew leaned in to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and devotion. "And I'm never leaving." May brought with it the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth Rose Jensen, a robust baby with her father's blue eyes and a set of lungs that announced her arrival to the entire valley. Thomas, now nearly 18 months old, was fascinated by his tiny sister, constantly wanting to touch her and bring her his favorite toys. Matthew was as attentive during this birth as he had been during Thomas's, though this time with considerably less drama as Mrs. Larson arrived well before the baby did. Rebecca found the birth easier the second time and was up and about much sooner, eager to settle into life as a family of 4. One evening, as the children slept and Rebecca and Matthew sat on their porch watching the sun set, Rebecca found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. "What's going on in that pretty head of yours?" Matthew asked, noticing her expression. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," Rebecca replied. "When I was left at that train depot, I thought my life was over. I never imagined I could be this happy." Matthew squeezed her hand. "I'm the lucky one. You and the children are the greatest blessing a man could ask for." As twilight deepened into night, they sat together in comfortable silence, secure in the love they had found against all odds. Rebecca knew that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together, the abandoned young woman and the cowboy who had waited with her until he became her future. The years passed, each one bringing its own joys and challenges to the Jensen family. Their ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management, allowing them to add a new wing to the house as their family grew. After Elizabeth came William, born 2 years later, and finally twins Sarah and Samuel, who arrived on a stormy night much like the one that had brought Thomas into the world. Thomas, though not Matthew's by blood, was his father's son in every way that mattered. By the time he was 10, he was already showing a natural affinity for ranching, following Matthew everywhere and soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Matthew legally adopted him on his 5th birthday, a day that had brought tears to Rebecca's eyes as she watched her son proudly sign his new name, Thomas Matthew Jensen, in childish script on the official documents. Life on the ranch was not always easy. There were harsh winters when feed ran low, and they worried about the livestock. Dry summers when the creek shrank to a trickle, and they prayed for rain. And the usual bumps and bruises that came with raising 5 active children. But through it all, the bond between Matthew and Rebecca only strengthened, their love deepening with each passing year. San Andreas grew as well, the small frontier town gradually expanding with the arrival of the railroad and new settlers. Mrs. Wilson eventually sold her boarding house and moved into a small cottage nearby, becoming a beloved grandmother to the Jensen children who delighted in their visits to town to see her. When Thomas turned 18, Matthew took him aside for a serious conversation. "Been thinking about the future," he said as they sat on the porch. "The Carson place next door is coming up for sale. Good land, good water rights. Thought we might buy it, you and me together, start building something bigger for the family." Thomas looked at his father with surprise. "Together? You mean as partners?" Matthew nodded. "You've got a good head for this business, better than mine in some ways. Seems right we should be partners." The pride and gratitude in Thomas's eyes reminded Rebecca so much of Matthew that her heart swelled. The abandoned baby she had carried to San Andreas was now a man, standing tall and strong beside the father who had chosen him. Life continued its steady rhythm of seasons and milestones. Elizabeth, as headstrong as her mother, insisted on attending the new teachers' college that opened in Sacramento, returning with not only a teaching certificate, but also a young doctor she had met there. William showed a talent for working with horses that surpassed even his father's, developing a reputation throughout the region for his gentle but effective training methods. The twins, though identical in appearance, were opposite in temperament, Sarah quiet and bookish, Samuel adventurous and outgoing but equally beloved. Through it all, Rebecca and Matthew remained the center of the family, their love serving as the foundation upon which everything else was built. Though Rebecca's hair began to show strands of silver and Matthew's face bore the lines of years spent working in the sun and wind, the way they looked at each other never changed. On a golden afternoon in October 1903, exactly 25 years after they had met at the train depot, Matthew surprised Rebecca with a special outing. He saddled their horses, she had become an accomplished rider over the years, and packed a basket of food. "Where are we going?" Rebecca asked as they rode away from the ranch. "You'll see," Matthew replied with the same small smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. He led her through the hills to a beautiful overlook where they could see the entire valley, including their ranch with its expanded house, numerous outbuildings, and the adjoining Carson property that Thomas now managed with his wife and their young son. Matthew spread a blanket on the grass and helped Rebecca sit down. From the basket, he produced a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "What's all this?" Rebecca asked, though she had a suspicion. 25 years ago today, a scared young woman and a lonely cowboy met at a train depot, Matthew said, pouring the wine. "Seems worth celebrating, doesn't it?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "You remembered the exact day. How could I forget? It was the day my life truly began." Matthew handed her a glass and raised his own. "To us, Rebecca, to 25 years of love and 5 beautiful children who call us mother and father." They clinked glasses and sipped the sweet wine. Rebecca leaned against Matthew's strong shoulder, feeling the same sense of security and belonging she had first experienced in his arms all those years ago. "Did you ever imagine, that day at the depot, that we would end up here?" she asked. Matthew's arm tightened around her. "I knew the moment I saw you that you were special. Didn't dare hope for all this, though. Never thought I could be so blessed." "Nor I," Rebecca said softly. "Thank you for waiting with me that day, for seeing something in me worth saving." You saved yourself, Rebecca Jensen, Matthew corrected gently. I just had the good sense to recognize the strongest, most beautiful woman I'd ever met and hold on tight. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Rebecca looked out over the life they had built together, the land, the home, the family. From abandonment and despair had come love and purpose. From a chance meeting at a train depot had grown a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Matthew's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "Ready to head back home?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, smiling at the man who had become her heart. "Yes," she said simply, "let's go home." And as they rode side by side toward the ranch where their children and grandchildren awaited them, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that the moment she had once thought was the end of her life had actually been just the beginning of the most beautiful journey she could have imagined, a journey of love that had started with a cowboy who waited with her until he became her future.